Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce you to this lunchtime roundtable on the crisis of gender diversity in theology and religious studies. Forming the basis of the discussion will be the report that Matthew and Sonya wrote with their colleague Robert Song, but then we'll have responses from Abby and Dawn. And before we get started, I just have one practical announcement. If you haven't returned your room key, please do, because I think you'll get a £70 charge if you don't. Okay, thank you.
Okay, this is an opportunity to report on a small project that was undertaken by myself, Sonya, and my colleague Robert Song about the underrepresentation of women, particularly in theology and religious studies across the UK, where, as it was pointed out just yesterday, I think, much of the sociology of religion happens to occur. And this arose out of concerns that Sonya and I had about the apparent decreasing representation of women through the progression of the academic career within this area, where we see lots of undergraduates lots of female undergraduates, and then it sort of tails off as we go through postgrad study and into the academic career itself, to the point that we have a very small proportion of women in senior roles. And we wanted to explore why that's the case, as well as mapping the evidence that we could find. So the report, which is freely available online, we've also got a few printed copies here, if anyone would like to take any away today, published just at the end of last year. The key aim is to measure the imbalance of gender with respect to staff and students within theology and religious studies departments in UK universities, and explore why these patterns appear as they do. And so we analysed statistics of staff and student representation using statistics from the Higher Education Statistics Agency, but also from those departments themselves. We invited them to send to us a statistical picture of their staff and student makeup in terms of seniority, and then divided by gender, so that we had a full picture, because the HESA data takes us so far but doesn't give us all the detail that we need. But then we had a series of interviews with female academics in the discipline, and with some senior gatekeeper people. Effectively, these were individuals, male and female, who were, because of the roles they'd occupied in different universities, were in a particularly advantageous position to comment on how things like recruitment occur, recruitment to new jobs, and promotional processes, and how they might have impacted on the patterns that we're observing. This is from the project report, just to summarise some of the kind of the picture that we're finding here. In talking to women scholars who are at varying stages of their careers about their experiences of academia, we have encountered many who speak about being in an environment where they are in the minority among men, in a culture that often affects their confidence, where they observe the difficulties of balancing the demands of academic and family life, and where they have experienced bullying and particular challenges in obtaining promotion. Some of the stories we heard were fairly alarming. The overall picture was too. So the aim in this research, quite understandably, is not simply to chart what's there, to find out what's happening and to try and understand why, but to also present these findings to audiences that might be in a position to actually do something about this significant structural problem in higher education. This is one of those contexts. So, just to give you some of the statistics that we uncovered. Gender distribution among theology and religious studies students and staff across the UK. There we go, we've got a majority female undergraduate population, 60%. The other undergraduates is really people who are doing slightly differently structured undergraduate degrees. It doesn't actually apply to many courses, but within theology it has resonance with ministry training and that sort of thing. It's not a major category for us here. Taught postgraduate, it goes down to 41%. Research postgraduate, PhD students, 33%. And then we get to academic staff, we've got less than a third. So the gender distribution has become inverted. And that's what it looks like in a nice diagram. Quite recently, I updated the figures because this was taken from statistical material pertinent to the 2010-11 academic year. You have to wait a little bit before the HESA data becomes available. So I updated this recently to 2012-13, when that became available. We've got the figures alongside them here. So what we're finding is, this is the proportion of female students in the discipline between those two periods, and we have a slight rise. But it's so small, and it's impossible to say whether this is simply a blip, whether it's just something that we'll find falls again in future trends. We can at least say major changes do not seem to be on the horizon. So this is among gender distribution among staff in the discipline across the UK at different levels of seniority. This is what we collected from departments themselves, because you can't get this on the national HESA database. You have to go and collect it from departments. So this is the proportion of early career academics, lecturers, senior lecturers, professors. As you can see, there's a general, although not straightforward, decline. The most alarming figure, of course, being that only 16% of professorial staff in theology and religious studies are female. This presents the data in comparison with other subject areas. So you only find out so much by taking TRS on its own. And so we gathered the information from the Higher Education Statistics Agency again, comparing undergraduates, postgraduate taught students and postgraduate research within TRS philosophy, English, maths, chemistry and anthropology. Now you'll see that the overall pattern for all of them, quite aside from a strange rise in the middle there for anthropology, is one of decline as academic progression moves forward. You have greater proportion of women at undergraduate level, and then a gradual dropping off as the academic career progresses into postgraduate study. But the most steep decline, significantly, is theology and religious studies. Even a discipline like chemistry, one of our old-fashioned hard sciences we might expect to be much more patriarchal and dominated by men, has managed to level things off reasonably well. And they don't seem to have, certainly, the same drop-off gradient that we find in TRS, where we find a quite dramatic decline in the proportion of women between undergraduate, postgraduate taught, and postgraduate research level. This is the same data, but in terms of a line, so you can observe the line of decline. It's the most dramatic dip there between undergraduate and postgraduate taught qualifications compared to all the other disciplines we looked at. So, to summarise what I've just outlined, there's a decline in theology and religious studies between the proportion of females at undergraduate level and at postgraduate research level. That amounts to 26.9 percentage points. The figure for philosophy is 11, for English it's 11, for maths it's 12, for chemistry it's 3, for anthropology it's 10.6. In other words, the drop-off rate for female TRS students is more than twice that of all these other subjects. So now we have the evidence. Now we have the evidence of significant drop-off of women in the discipline. We need to find out why that might be the case. Sonya is going to talk about the qualitative interviews that we undertook.
Thanks, Matthew. So I'm going to talk about the interviews that we did and some of the themes that emerged from those interviews. As part of our study, we conducted 13 extended interviews with senior academics that had occupied significant gatekeeper roles such as head of department, head of faculty, or research group, and we interviewed female academics working in TRS, from postdoctoral researchers through to newly appointed lecturers, senior lecturers, and professors. And so I'm going to discuss what came out of those interviews. And the first one being that we found that the presence of theology within UK universities draws on long-standing connections with churches, especially as they relate to arrangements for the training of clergy. Interviewees noted that the church's long history of gender imbalance could affect theology departments, while religious studies departments have made efforts to establish the academic study of religion independent of such links. And here was a quote from one of our participants who addressed this in her way. I think the gender balance is made worse in theology because of the general attitude towards women in Christianity as a whole that then affects how seriously women's work is taken by academics in theology, although it isn't so bad in religious studies. Another theme that emerged was that some subdisciplines of theology were seen to attract more men, such as systematic theology and biblical studies, while others, such as Old Testament studies, recognized this and were making efforts to be more welcoming to younger scholars, of which many are women. And here's one of the quotes from one of our participants who talked about ST. Systematic theology, which is my field, is still pretty male-dominated, and the Society for the Study of Theology, which is the British scholarly society for the discipline, is still too male-dominated. There are not as many women graduate students working in systematic theology as there should be. I found it relatively difficult to recruit significant numbers of women to work in ST, although I have had 2 or 3 very able ones in recent years, but on the whole, most of the applications I receive are from men rather than women. Interviewees also discussed feminist thought as an approach to theology and the study of religion, which brought to the fore a number of issues. Among women setting out on academic careers, some chose not to be identified with feminist approaches since they didn't wish to be pigeonholed. You're a feminist academic, so you must be doing feminist theology. Though one interviewee was happy to teach feminist theology in order to secure a permanent post. But this quote gives an example of how feminism or being a feminist can be received. The small band of female scholars that would now be happy to call themselves feminists are kept at arm's length to some extent. It is a bit of a dirty word these days and replaced by gender studies and the like. Amongst the more enlightened, I think, there's probably more sympathy. But no, the label feminist now is going to position you. I think women would feel that that is going to position them as angry and a troublemaker. And this kind of brings to mind what Sarah Ahmed has written about the feminist killjoy. As she states, to be recognized as a feminist is to be assigned a difficult category and a category of difficulty. Closely connected to other themes is the issue of whether academic disciplines foster particular ways of behaving that are exclusionary. Professor Helen Beebe has discussed this with regard to the discipline of philosophy and how the culture of philosophical discussion is one that tends to alienate women. The nature of such discussions can be aggressive, confrontational style of interaction, which is apparently commonplace within philosophy seminars. Beebe argues for a more supportive and collaborative style of discussion. Amongst our interviewees, some felt a sense of belittlement within male-dominated seminar contexts, and male postgraduates sometimes appeared just as culpable as academic staff in perpetuating the offending style of discussion. But much depends on individual staff members. and on the cultures fostered within particular subdisciplines and even departments. And it may be significant that women are more numerous within subdisciplines such as religious studies that are characterized by a more collaborative and supportive style of discussion than some subfields in traditional theology. Confidence. A large number of respondents felt that there were gender-related dimensions of academic confidence at every level, from giving conference papers to applying for jobs to seeking promotion. And I'll say a bit more about confidence in a moment. But some of the generic issues faced by women in the academy that is not particular to TRS, but one being the decision to have children and an academic career is compounded by precarious employment, possible financial debt tied to student loans, the publish-or-perish culture, and these are all significant reasons why women pull out of the academic job market and do not pursue doctoral study as well. The long hours culture and work-life balance, although this may be endemic to the profession, the burden of this weighs differently on those who have caring responsibilities. Bullying, as Matthew mentioned, there came from respondents plenty of evidence, some of it quite shocking, of bullying of individual women. In some cases, this was bullying from heads of department or senior members of the university, but more than one case was of being bullied as head of department by other senior male colleagues within the department, or even of being bullied by junior male colleagues. In some cases, this had been resolved or at least addressed through recourse to formal procedures. In other cases, it had required considerable personal resilience and ingenuity to find acceptable outcomes through informal means, while in other cases it was just left to fester. Criteria for promotion, particularly in research-led universities, tend to emphasize research to the near exclusion of all other forms of contribution to university life. And this can disadvantage women who take career breaks for maternity or childcare reasons. It can also disadvantage them in that many are likely to assume other kinds of roles within the university, such as particular administrative and pastoral responsibilities. And as some interviewees suggested, they may also be more likely to fill in for colleagues or be helpful around the department, building up large credit balances that somehow never seem to get repaid. But in relation to traditional roles and promotion, and in the efforts to change academic culture so that women's achievements are recognized, I just wanted to flag up recent research by Bostock and colleagues at Cambridge University, who advocate redefining the meaning of success in order to affect women's career progression and gender equality in the academy. And Bostock found that women in the academy did not necessarily suffer from a lack of confidence, but defined their successes differently. And these were largely based in relational aspects as opposed to lone individual trajectories and achievements. She found that influence or power was often embraced, but only insofar as it enabled a person to instigate important change, conduct an interesting piece of research, or set up a new project. Many of the women put far greater stock in having the freedom to pursue deeply interesting work for which they felt a real passion, or placed importance on who you are and how you behave in relation to others, and the ability to work collaboratively that produces high-quality work as part of an effective team, rather than just getting individual credit. Integrity, healthy working relationships, and developing those around them were important to their definitions of success and confidence. So there could be some, I think, important things there for us to think about in terms of women's career progression in the academy. And I also just wanted to highlight, while it wasn't necessarily a theme that came out of our interviews, but our research examined the experiences of white men and women in the academy. Yet, as we know, racialized experiences of gender also impact on men and women in the academy, resulting in multiple forms of inclusion and exclusion. And so, for example, recently highlighted at a public talk titled Why Isn't My Professor Black at University College London, a number of black scholars claimed that insidious forms of racism continue and may explain. Oh, sorry. I didn't expect that. Excuse me. It's hard to talk about these issues. Oh, I totally didn't expect that. That's okay. Why just 85 of the UK's 18,500 professors are black, and only 17 are black women. Shirley Ann Tate, associate professor in the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leeds, has stated that black academics are often excluded from academic networks crucial for advancement and struggle to find mentors because black academics were seen as outsiders. So I think it's crucial within our respective disciplines to consider the ways gender intersects with race, class, age, and ability to affect women's experiences and career progression in academia. And how Marika Rose pointed out to us in a response that she made to our report, that different women will face different barriers to inclusion because each has very different levels of power and privilege themselves. So in conclusion, and among several recommendations that our report makes, and this is just in conclusion to my part, amongst the changes in academic culture and university structures which were picked out by interviewees as addressing some of the issues were effective systems of academic mentoring in order to help junior staff learn to negotiate the system, active informal support from senior members of staff, especially women academics, and the presence of visible role models who could inspire younger generations of female scholars.
I first of all want to thank my colleagues for inviting me. Right from the beginning, I was hopeful that I could have a role in this. I had much of the same response as I've seen here today, both the shock, the sadness, the horror, and the anger that we've seen today. So let me do what I can to contribute to that with what I'll describe as a sociologist's response to this report. When I looked at it, I saw and picked up, I want to talk about three things that really came for me strongly through the report. And I want to talk about the practices of muting. I want to talk about how we should name the beneficiaries, the relational aspect of this, and then, of course, in more detail, the Socrel response. So what do you mean by this? Well, I'm talking, of course, about power and language. And I was thinking about the techniques of discourse analysis, particularly the attention drawn by scholars like Norman Fairclough to language and power, and to show the importance of what's privileged in some cases by silence. So I want to draw your attention to a couple of aspects in the report. For example, I drew out this paragraph that tells us that women are attracted to a career in higher education because of its autonomy, collaboration, intellectual rewards, but universities have been slow to institutionalize gender equality. Well, have they? What happens if we introduce the word men to that paragraph? Men have been slow to institutionalize gender equality. These aren't impersonal objects. Universities are peopled by people. Senior management and professors, as we heard today, predominantly are men. So let's name this. Let's think about being active in some of this. This paragraph, which was shocking from one of the interviews. The experience of walking into staff social settings where they were ignored. How about putting that into the active voice? Women's experience of walking into staff social settings where men ignore women. Is that what we're talking about? I think this is what we're talking about. We're talking about everyday, real practices where women are being constantly discriminated against and bullied largely by men. Let's even get worse and take a Marxist orientation. Okay? Who benefits from this appropriation of women's labor? Like all questions of power, we should know what's involved. We should know what's at stake, and we should know who is benefiting. Now, we saw these statistics today about women's withdrawal as they go up through their time in THRS and, of course, in other related disciplines. Who benefits from this? What happens when women withdraw, and why is this so? And we've had some very interesting observations in the report by why that might be so, ranging from issues of women not being sufficiently supported as they go through career transitions. We've had this about some of the male-dominated practices in some kinds of teaching. We had some observations in the report, which weren't mentioned particularly today, but I found very interesting, about the sorts of people who are given privileges by their churches, often men, to come and do postgraduate study. So there are many reasons that we have found, and I know that Sonya's, as well, I pulled up the same quote I found very interesting from Helen Beebe, talking about the nature of some of the disciplines and the nature of some of the ways that these disciplines are gendered. Now, I know this happens in other disciplines, and Matthew drew our attention to that, although it seems to be much worse in this discipline. And why? For the reasons that were mentioned. Women are often accorded roles of pastoral care. These things don't count as much as other male-dominated roles. And this frees time, of course, for men to pursue the other high-status work of getting published or funded. And so what did we decide at Socrel to do? Well, yes, you've heard some things so far. First of all, this is one of them. We were very pleased when we had this proposal for the conference, and I very much encouraged this sort of approach, that we could have the discussion about this report and amongst yourselves. You've heard a little bit about the mentoring scheme that Socrel is going to promote with Sonya, and we'll bring in much more detail about this as we go through the next few weeks. But in principle, the idea is that senior women in the academy will be able to mentor typically more junior women, giving them insights in some of those things that they probably need more help with because of all the issues we've heard today. This might range from writing, from publishing, from funding. The scheme will be open to members of Socrel, both women members as mentors and women as mentees. They'll be open to people from their first PhD onwards to senior lecturer roles and reader roles, and also open to people in different forms of employment. So open to women on teaching contracts and as well as fractional contracts, including zero contracts. It will be open to early career researchers, sometimes between posts. We know very much of this kind of fractured way that many people, especially women, go through their careers. So it'll be a very open and inclusive scheme, and we're very much looking forward to starting this in the next couple of months with Sonya. In addition to that, as you've heard, we're having the annual Socrel Chairs Day, which is my role as Socrel Chair to try to identify an issue that needs some response. So the Socrel Response is our annual event now, and this one will be about gender. And it will be, thinking back on what Sonya said earlier, very important that we look very widely. It will be about the intersections, the interrogations, and the practices in the academy more widely. The call for papers for this will go out shortly. But finally, let me conclude by reinforcing a point that was made earlier. Gender discrimination, particularly discrimination against women, has important implications for the disciplines in many ways, not just, as we've heard today, the important way of women's progression, but also on the production and dissemination of knowledge itself. Some people have pointed this out. I frequently use the work of Fiona Bowie in this regard. She's taken great care in her work to point out in the anthropology of religion, and we could certainly apply this to the sociology of religion, that knowledge itself has been created because male voices have been privileged They've been privileged in terms of the informants that tell us about religion. They've been privileged in terms of those people whose theories we use. And so we need to ask ourselves sometimes, are we talking about an understanding of religion, or are we talking about an understanding of religion that men have talked about? Women's voices, both as informants and as scholars, need to be further engaged. I find this in my own work that I do, helping people get research funded. And some years ago, I saw some research from the research councils that showed that women are granted fewer proposals than men. And they wonder why this was so. And they looked inside to the councils, to the Wellcome Trust and others, to say, what's going on here? Why is this so? And they found the problem didn't occur inside the research councils. They found that of the applications that they had received, most of them did not show a gender imbalance in terms of success. The problem began before they got into the research council. In other words, fewer women are submitting applications for funding than men. And they looked at reasons that might be so, and unsurprisingly found exactly what you were saying, that because funding often goes along with more senior positions, the lack of seniority reflected the lack of women being given the time and the status. The other situation is in women's publishing. And again, I've done quite a lot of work with women and why they are less published than men. And again, we find some of those systemic reasons. What I'd like to draw attention to as a final thought was some of the other recommendations that were up there about how work is accorded in departments, how work is rewarded, and who does what, and thinking about the gender balances that occurs there. I'm always struck at this one thing I find quite amusing. You know, we often hear about how women are better at multitasking than men. Girls, honey, how do we fall for that stuff? What a nice idea that women can do that, isn't it? Women can cook dinner at the same time as they can proof their journal articles, or someone's journal article. So I always encourage women not to multitask. I encourage them to look very much at their own work and do things that need to be done to benefit their own progression, to stop giving free labor to men and stop giving the sorts of support that means they're marginalizing their own careers. So I'd like to thank you and congratulate you for this report and for bringing it forward. I want to say how excited I am with Socrel to be bringing in some of these ideas, like mentoring, and I look forward to working with members here and others and doing as much as we can in whatever ways we can to try to redress that gender imbalance and fix some of this gender trouble that we see in the academy. Thank you. Thank you.
So last week I was chatting to my head of department about taking part in this panel and about coming to Socrel. And he'd read the report, as had most of my colleagues. I'd made sure I'd forwarded it around all of my networks in the department and made sure they read it. And we'd had some interesting departmental conversations about it over coffee. And as I was telling him about it, he said, so what is your response to the report? And I said, well, at the moment, I'm not really sure, but I think the report chimes with some of my own experiences, and as a feminist researcher working in theology and religious studies, I can obviously draw on that. And he just looked at me and he said, aren't you angry? And I kind of realised that I kind of started to theorise it a little bit rather than actually be angry. And I was a bit taken aback by his question, and I was a bit disappointed in myself for not being, at the time when I first read the report, angry. So I tweeted about it, I posted it on Facebook, suggested the stats, mulled over some of the qualitative comments that were made, talked about it with colleagues, all without being angry. And let me just put this into a little bit of context. I'm often quite angry about gender injustice. But my head of department is right. Anger is an appropriate response. So I am going to channel the feminist killjoy that Sarah Ahmed makes reference to and be a little bit angry throughout my response. Because we should be shocked and we need to be a little bit unsettled, very unsettled, by the report's findings, by the low conversion of women undergraduates to postgraduates, by the bleak outlook for women as they try to join the 16% of women comprising professorial positions, the barriers to promotions, the challenges of balancing caring and family commitments, the dangers of taking a career break or assuming certain kinds of pastoral or administrative or teaching roles in a department, and the devaluing of work on feminism, religion and gender, and the bullying. And we should be exasperated that in 2014, as the report highlights, fewer than 10% of theology and religious studies departments are made up of more than half women. And that only 39% of departments, there are only figures identified where female members take up a quarter or less of the academic team. So then that made me think, well, why on this first reading was I not more angry? Why was I kind of just thinking about an academic response? And I think for me it was a kind of tired resignation when I got the findings. And for the female companions that I've been sharing my academic journey with, many who are here at this conference, this report is not a surprise. It's not new. But that's why it's really important. That's why it's actually a really important piece of research. Because it identifies and formalises the gender patterns that have shaped my academic training. And it names what we've noticed and experienced since our undergraduate days, through to MA studies, doctoral studies, and as we enter the workplace for the first time as early career researchers. So for instance, in the late 1990s as an undergraduate, there were no female members of staff in my philosophy department, and in my systematic theology classes, I was only taught by male academics, accompanied by mature men en route to ordination. It wasn't until my third year, when I went to study abroad in Canada, that I was taught by a woman in philosophy and theology and religious studies. And it was a course on feminist theology. And during that year abroad, it was the first time I'd come across feminist critical discourse, gender, class and race as a tool of analysis. So I was 21 and 3/4 of the way through my degree when I had this revelation. When I returned to finish my honours year at my home institution, I was full of feminism. So I took the one course I could that included a bit of feminism in the content. It was called Theology, Ideology and Culture, and it was taught by a male prof, really well known for his critique that feminism was a failed project. It's a surprise I'm here at all, really. So as a postgraduate pursuing work in gender and in religion, I encountered what the report characterises as the kind of the way that gender is sometimes a soft subject in what we do, but what Ursula King has called the double gender blindness affecting religious work in gender. So while it's problematic to use the metaphor of disability to identify a lack like this, what Ursula was trying to name was the way that arts, humanities, social sciences often affect religion, but the field of TRS then often marginalises work on gender. And I think we've all probably had examples of this. I was often asked all the way through my doctoral studies why I was studying women, knowing that the bloke round the corner looking at Bart wasn't asked why he was looking at Bart or looking at men. I've been to conferences which seem to have a similar approach to including feminist work in theologies as the participants in the report share. Or as Linda Woodhead once described the way that feminist theology and studies of feminism and religion is ghettoised. It's that kind of, there's some women that are talking about Islam, it's a gender and Islam panel, right? Or I've been to, there's some women that are engaging with Sarah Coakley and they're talking about pneumatology, it must be feminism and pneumatology time. I've heard stories of bullying and sexism from more experienced academics throughout their careers, particularly if they've had children. I've seen male senior academics be rude to female invited speakers in research seminars because they've only focusing on gender. I've heard my female colleagues described as difficult when offering informed opinions and erudite observations. And I've counselled one friend who got feedback on an interview for a post she didn't get when she was told, you need to learn to have more presence with men. And you come across in interviews too much of a woman. I think knowing the extent to which women are underrepresented in TRS has led me to this resignation, which I think may have been compounded because I had converted from undergraduate to postgraduate to early career research to a full-time permanent position. I'm lucky enough to be part of a cohort of scholars in RS and sociology and religion who've made very similar transitions. And I'm fortunate to have an academic community in Socrel. But resignation is detrimental when it comes to working against ongoing inequalities. And for me, by naming the barriers to career progression, this report challenges my complacency. So as well as naming the gender gap in career progression for the discipline, this report makes recommendations on how that gap may be tackled. And I think mentoring is central. So when reflecting on my trajectory from my journey from early career, from undergraduate to here, it wouldn't have been possible without the informal and formal mentoring from men and women that the report suggests is vital for success and for building confidence. I hadn't considered postgraduate work until a female prof, again in this utopic land of Canada where all is possible, suggested that I should. In my final undergraduate year, I had a very supportive male dissertation supervisor and a male module leader who kept pushing me and my work to always take a position, take a feminist stance. Crucially, I chose to do postgraduate work at Lancaster because of its reputation for women's and feminist studies and religion. I was mentored formally by my supervisor and by a head of department at the time who was a woman, and I had female friends studying religion and gender. All necessary weapons, I think, in the war against what the report names as imposter syndrome, although I'm not actually sure if that ever goes away. So I'm now in my department. I'm one of 6 full-time permanent women with 8 male colleagues. Gender research is in the ether, as the report recommends, and our first-year courses include topics on gender and feminist approaches to biblical studies, religion and theology, and it's a pattern that's mostly adopted throughout the curriculum. So mentoring works, and that's why I'm absolutely ecstatic that Socrel are taking a very deliberate strategic decision to do that with Sonya and myself doing this. And as the report and my experiences suggest, things are changing, they are shifting perhaps. There are signs, I think you said, of kind of change, didn't you? Some positives at the end of your report. But we can't be complacent, because it's going to be a big challenge, I think, in converting heads of department, deans and university management and academic organisations other than Socrel from that initial kind of sympathy or hopefully outrage in reading the report to adopting some of the other strategies the report makes. And it's vital now that the gender gap has been formally named, that, as Sonya pointed out, that other intersections of identity that are barriers to progression are named. So race, age, class, sexuality, disability. They're rarely represented on the photo boards in kind of staff departments where they come in always. So I'm going to finish there, really. But I'd just like to thank the authors for the report and for undertaking this work and for asking me to respond, but more importantly, for reminding me to be rightfully angry.